Hi and welcome everybody. My name is Ken. I'm a sourdough homemaker, and in this video I want to give you the most comprehensive guide on how to bake beautiful, tasty sourdough bread in your own home. With that, let's get to it. The sourdough bread making process might look a little intimidating. Don't worry, I'm going to walk you through every step of this process. 6 steps. First step, Autolyse, nothing but a fancy word for mixing just the flour and the water, nothing else, and allowing the flour to soak up the water and starting some of those enzymatic processes. The fermentation only begins when we add the sourdough, and what sourdough really does, just like any yeast, is it starts munching through your flour and creating the lovely little gas bubbles that we are after in bread making. That's how we get the fluffy little crust, and that's how we get sort of this leavened bread. Kneading then is the process of kind of giving the dough strength, giving it structure, allowing the dough to actually trap and capture those gas bubbles so that they don't go out there. Bulk fermentation, why is it called bulk fermentation? This is the process where we let the sourdough do its work, and we do that in the whole bulk of the dough, meaning if you make 2 loaves at once, which is something I do, this is basically before you divide the dough in the next step and create individual loaves. And this is step 4, you divide the dough and you shape the loaves into individual little loaves that get put into little bannetons that then get proofed again, but in the fridge to develop sort of this lovely tangy and acidic flavor profile that we're after. Lastly, after 8 to 24 hours of cold proof, we bake our bread. Now, if you look at the entire time frame of this process, it's roughly 25 hours or up to 25 hours, depending on how long you let your bread sit in the fridge. Now, this is a little intimidating, so what I personally do is when I bake on weekends, I get my starter ready on a Friday so that I can kickstart this entire process on a Saturday so that I can bake on a Sunday. So that's what I personally do. So with that said, I would suggest that we actually get right into it and start with step number 1, the Autolyse. Okay, so what do we need to get started with our Autolyse? In terms of tools, what you're going to need is a digital scale. This is not the time to work with cups and football fields. This is grams and digital scales. You need a nice sturdy bowl, and super helpful, a little bowl scraper. This is one of those relatively sturdy ones, really a great help to stir everything together. Everything else I'm gonna do by hand. I wouldn't judge you if you now bust out your mixer and give the whole dough a kneading with a machine. You can totally do that. Personally, it's just that I really enjoy working with my hands and feeling the dough, just like the adult version of playing with Play-Doh, basically. Okay, in terms of ingredients, I'm going to I'm going to write the exact measurements into the description below. But in terms of flours, what do we have? First and foremost, we have a flour called a bread flour. It's a strong, or as you can call it, a strong flour. It's essentially a flour that has a higher gluten content than you would normally find in a supermarket. Given that flour is really hard to come by in supermarkets anyway, my strong recommendation for you would be to actually look up a specialty shop. There are many small little manufacturers of flours. This is the time to get the really good flour. This is essentially one of the core ingredient of your bread, so why don't you get the best flour that you can find? This here is from a small little shop in Berlin called Mehlstübchen, and it's a 550 flour that's going to be the basis of our recipe. So you're going to need that. It's a white flour, and then I also use a whole grain flour. In this case, I'm going to use a wheat variety here, but also I really enjoy playing quite a bit with all those ancient grains. For instance, here is kamut, and then there's rye flour that I also use every now and then, as well as einkorn, just to kind of play with different flavor profiles it's good fun to just kind of experiment. Okay, with that said, let's start the basic recipe. I'm gonna start my scale and I'm going to measure out the first ingredient, which is my red flour. And into the bowl, I'm going to put 400 grams of just regular red flour. And next in go 100 grams of whole grain flour. In this case, I'm just going to mix a little bit. I'm going to mix, let's say 50 grams, why don't we, of whole grain wheat flour, as well as 50 grams of kamut, which has a really interesting flavor. Just a touch. Kamut has a slightly yellow hue to it. It's a lovely flour. Lovely. Next, in goes the water. So let's clean out a little bit. And we are going to need about 370 grams of water. Now, with water, what's really important is the temperature, because as I told you before, yeast really likes it warm. So I have lukewarm, tepid water here that really puts the yeast off to a really good start. So in go 370 milliliters. I'm gonna keep actually 20 milliliters in the bowl to make the later processes a little easier. So now we have the flour and the water in the bowl. Next, all we need to do is mix it until there are no dry spots left. And I'm just going to use my hands for that. So, and really there isn't much of a technique to this. There are many people who, I don't know, would use a spoon at this point. Personally, I just really enjoy feeling the temperature of the water, feeling whether that's right for the dough. My personal technique really is here, this little kind of like grabbing the dough, working in the water. That works really quite well for me, but you can also totally work with a stirring motion. Now, another pro tip that I have for you at this point is try and keep your left hand clean, because if the phone rings, and it will ring if you have both hands in the dough, you have one hand free. Okay, so I'm not actually going to knead the dough a lot here. I'm just going to basically squeeze in the water until it's nicely combined. What you can do as well is you can kind of use the dough a little bit to clean the sides of the bowl a little bit. For some reason, gluten has these cleaning properties that work quite well. As you can see, there is really no way to avoid the mess. And yes, bread making is a sticky process. There's just no way around it. I still have to deal with it. Keep that bowl scraper nearby. Now, many people at this point would be tempted to add more flour, because flour helps kind of unsticking everything. But we're not going to do that, because that will kind of knock off our carefully calibrated balance between the flour and the water. And the water content is what really defines this recipe and what really is important to the sort of handling properties of the dough and how the bread is going to come out. So don't add any flour, just live with the fact that it's slightly sticky, and use a bowl scraper to clean off your hands. And all I'm going to do is scrape down the sides of the bowl a little bit. And that's it for step one. All that's left to do is put a lid on it, just to avoid the plastic. I have one of those silicone lids, and I'm going to let this rest for about 30 minutes. So where are we in the process? We've done the Autolyse, we've given the flour a chance to soak up the water, and now it's time to move on to step number 2, adding the starter and kneading the dough. We have here the Autolyse dough. Looks pretty shaggy, not really developed just yet. So let's see what it looks like when we add the sourdough. And the sourdough, Siegfried, right here, as you can see by the rubber band marking, has started this morning when I fed him about 4 or 5 hours ago, up to this amount, and it more than doubled, almost tripled to here. So this is how you can tell that the sourdough is ready to get to work. Also, you can smell a ripe sourdough has this kind of vinegary flavor and odor to it. I personally quite like it. So let's add the sourdough. I measured out 100 grams in here. Let's put it in here. For that, a rubber spatula is a fantastic idea to just kind of keep the sides a little clean. And as you can see, all I'm doing is I'm basically keeping a tiny rest of the sourdough in my container, ready for the next time. And that's really all you need to keep. People don't sometimes think that you have to keep a huge jar of sourdough in your container, but really all you need is barely basically what's left in the container after you kind of cleaned it out. That's completely enough to create new sourdough. I'm gonna kind of smear it around a little bit, and then I'm gonna dimple it in with my fingers a little bit like so, and then I'm just gonna grab the dough from underneath and kind of fold it over the sides to the center. Really nice and easy, just kind of creating layers of sourdough that kind of spread throughout the dough. And that's really all I'm doing at this first initial stage. I'm just gonna flip it around a little bit, just kind of really using my hands to just kind of twist it a little bit and just kind of mixing it, just making sure that the sourdough is nicely distributed throughout the dough. And there's really no technique at this point. It's really just mixing it. That's already good enough for a first step. You really don't need to overwork the dough, because what we're going to do is we're going to actually give the dough another little break, maybe somewhere between 10 to 30 minutes, before we then actually add the salt. And that will be the moment in which we do my favorite part of this whole process. We knead the dough. 10 minutes fast forward. We have mixed in the sourdough into the dough. Looks like so. Now it's time to add the salt. Why didn't we add the salt right with the sourdough? Maybe it's baker's superstition, I don't really know, but let's just say sourdough doesn't really like salt all that much. So we give the two kind of a chance to separate a little bit so that they don't get in touch with each other directly, because salt kind of inhibits the growth of the yeast. I'm gonna put in 11 grams of salt, and salt, don't ever forget the salt. Bread without salt does not taste good at all. And those are the 20 milliliters of water that I kind of left out earlier, which totals up to 370 milliliters of water. Just putting that in, that'll make the addition of the salt a little easier. Again, same process. I'm dimpling in the salt and the water a little bit, and then just kind of like folding over the dough a little bit. And as you can see, the dough at this point is still really quite shaggy and not really smooth, and it's also not very extensible. So if I take a piece of dough and I kind of pull at it, it'll tear quite soon. So why do we need to fix that? Why do we need to develop the dough and develop that gluten? And now the dough looks like I ruined it, right? It's like it's a complete mess. So why do we need gluten? Well, gluten is first and foremost the protein molecules that are part of our grain. And what gluten does for us in bread making is it kind of creates this mesh network. The protein molecules, they kind of link together, and they form this kind of like, it behaves like a rubber band basically, or like a balloon. And what we're going to do, or what we have been doing with the addition of the sourdough, is we create carbon dioxide, gas, basically little gas bubbles. And if those gas bubbles don't get trapped in the dough by this balloon rubber texture, then basically it'll be lost for our leavening. So that's why it's so important to develop our dough. And the process we develop dough is by kneading it. Kneading is nothing but a fancy word for stretching the dough on top of each other. And there's my favorite technique. It's called slap and fold. So let's talk about this technique in detail. Some people kind of struggle with it the first time they try. So the first and important thing to notice is that the dough has two sides. The top side has a little tension to it, and that means that it's less sticky than the sticky underside that's kind of shaggy and messy. So what we want to do is we want to keep the top at the top at all times. And the way we achieve that is by grabbing the dough from here. I'm going to show you in really slow motion, and slapping this portion of the dough onto the table. And it's really much more about the pulling towards me than it is about the downward slapping. Let me demonstrate. So I'm not just slapping downwards, I am also pulling towards me, because stretching the gluten is what really creates this structure that we're after. So let's try this again. Slapping, pulling, letting go. And this letting go is this little motion where you kind of flick the dough back on the table. Slap, pull, and let go. I'm going to link in the video description a video by a baker called Bertinet, who gives a wonderful description about how this works. And in normal speed, it kind of looks like this. Your neighbors are going to love you for it, but it's just so much fun. And I recommend it. It's a fantastic workout, and it's so much better than using the machine. And as you can see, if you look at the table in front of me, I'm kind of cleaning the table as I'm doing this. The dough will kind of grab hold of the pieces here and there. And if that doesn't work, the tool number one that I would recommend to you guys is a bench scraper. It's a fantastic tool. Just kind of give the dough a little bit of a cleanup. So I'm just going to clean up the table around. Now, this tool is super useful. Many people struggle with it at the beginning as well. And here's why. It's a two-hand job. Basically, what you need to have is a little bowl with water on your table, and you keep your left hand slightly moist, not wet. Drip off the excess. And whenever you work with a bench scraper, what you do is you give the dough a pull into one direction, and as you can see, it starts forming a little skin, creates tension. But when I want to release, let's do it without my hand, the dough will naturally follow the knife, and then we kind of destroy the tension that we just created. So the way it really works is by pushing the dough, using my left hand by being between the knife and the dough, and then pulling the knife out quite fast. Demonstrate that again. Pushing, 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 pushing. Use my left hand, release the knife. And you can do that for as long as you like. Just clean it up. The important bit is keep the top at the top. Let's say you messed up and you put the sticky side on top. Now this is the sticky side. It's quite easy to fix that. Again, make my left hand a little moist. Give it a push. And go in a curve, because that way I never run out of table to work with. And all of a sudden we have a nice, smooth, domed little dough to work with. Let's just give it another slap, why don't we? And that already feels really nice and smooth and developed. So you can also do what I just did with my bench scraper with your hand. The way this works is you use basically your pinkies to kind of pull or drag the dough over the table, and that creates this little skin or this little tension that makes gluten appear so smooth. So here's a nicely developed dough, and how can you tell? How long do you have to actually knead the dough until it looks like this? Well, that entirely depends on how fast and how strong you slap it. But one way to test is by making your hands a little wet, like so, and then grabbing on to a portion of the dough, kind of pulling it out a little bit. And as you can see, it's not really, I can pull it quite nicely and it's not tearing. So that to me is a good sign that this dough is nicely developed. Just giving it a little cleanup. And that is good enough for me to take the next step. So where are we? We finished kneading our dough. It's nice and smooth. I put it back into its bowl. Lid on. It's hanging out in there. Great. On to step number 3, bulk fermentation. Now bulk fermentation doesn't mean anything different to what happened here in terms of the fermentation itself. Basically, the sourdough, Siegfried, is already doing its work. It's already eating through the flour. Now, the only difference here to traditional bread making is that this yeast is much, much slower than the commercial yeast that you would find in the supermarket. So this is where sourdough bread making gets a little involved. Because as the fermentation happens, what we need to do is we need to give the dough strength and structure, and we need to redistribute the gas bubbles so that we don't have huge holes on this side and no holes on the other side. So I'm going to teach you a technique on how to redistribute the bubbles while giving the dough a lot of strength and structure. And for this, I need to change containers. Now I have here a heavy Pyrex dish. And the important thing about it is that it has straight sides. So this makes it a lot easier for me to see and to judge how much the dough has actually grown in the time period. Because the only thing that I'm really interested in at this point in the process of the bulk fermentation is how much has the dough risen in the given time. So for that to happen, I'm just gonna put the dough in there. Always make your hands a little wet. And that is that. Now, let's talk about folding. Folding is the technique that we apply to give the dough strength and to kind of redistribute the gas bubbles. And why do we need strength in the first place, and what is strength? So as you have seen, the dough has kind of this little domey shape to it, or had. It has now relaxed a little bit. However, the dough needs to have enough strength not to turn into a pancake as soon as it starts baking. And in order for us to do that, we kind of need to give it strength. And the way this works is through folding. So what I'm doing here is I'm making my hands a little wet, not too wet. I'm grabbing the dough from the sides and just kind of pulling it upwards a little bit until this side of the dough kind of folds or tucks underneath this side. Okay? Do this again on the other side. Very carefully, just reaching underneath, pulling it up until it releases off the bowl. We tuck this side under here. You can see from the side it's like a little croissant. Okay, I'm going to do this side here as well. Do both at the same time. And as you can see, now it has a nice little domey shape to it. And that has kind of folded the dough on top of itself, as well as given it a lot of strength. Now back on goes the lid, and this process is going to happen for the next 3 to 4 hours, depending on how warm your kitchen is. Now this dough wants to be anywhere between 25 and 27 Celsius. This is when yeast works the most and works the best. So you want to keep it nice and warm, and depending on how warm it is, this process is going to take anywhere between 3 and 6 hours. So for how long do I have to keep doing this? And how often? Well, what we're really interested in is the growth of this dough to 50% of its original volume. So personally what I do is I give this dough a fold every hour or so, and it entirely depends on your schedule and what you're able to kind of put into this dough. The more frequently you give your dough folds, the more strength it will develop, and the more tall and round your loaf will be. If you can only do it, let's say twice, that's also fine, and the dough will still turn into a lovely bread, but it might not be quite as tall. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put the lid on, keep it in a nice and warm place, and return to it in an hour. Okay, 1 hour later, let's take a look at what it has become. And as you can see, it's kind of flattened out a little bit, and that's what gluten does. Unlike a rubber that basically stays tense, what gluten does is it'll relax over time. And basically, that's also because, think of it as a rubber balloon that has absolutely no air in it. Because right now, fermentation, when it starts, it's an exponential process, which means in the beginning there's a whole lot of nothing, like in our Corona cases, and then all of a sudden it'll grow. And the same is true for yeast and its production of carbon dioxide. Right now, what I've done is I've developed the gluten, but I haven't really added much gas to it just yet. So that's the reason why this balloon without being stretched by being filled with gas, just kind of flattens out again. So we're just going to keep doing what we're doing. I'm wetting my hands a little bit, I'm reaching underneath. And as you can see, it's already kind of sticking less to the bowl. Tucking this end under. This technique, by the way, is called a coil fold. I think it was developed by an Instagrammer that creates marvelous breads. I'm going to link them below. And as you can see already at this point, the loaf stands slightly taller than before, and it will take a little longer time for it to flatten out completely. Actually, it's not 1 hour later, it's 2 hours later. We skipped right into the next step of the process because my dough is looking fantastic. As you can see, it has risen quite a bit, and more interestingly, it has kept its strength quite a bit. So you can see that it's not flattening out quite as much as it did in the beginning. And that's a sign for me that the gas is in there and it's giving the dough the strength to kind of hold up its shape on its own. So that means the bulk fermentation is complete. This is definitely more than 50% growth, and I'm ready to go into the next step. Number 4, divide and shape. Now, dividing is not necessary because I made a single recipe. So this is already the size of exactly 1 loaf. So let's talk about what shaping actually means. Shaping means that I turn this guy, who's kind of almost looks like a bread already, into a properly formed loaf. And for that to happen, what I'm doing is I'm actually taking it out of the bowl. And it's already holding its shape quite a bit. Now what we're doing is we're giving it even more tension, and the way we do that is with our bench scraper. And the important thing here, wet hands, make sure that this is a 2-hand job. Pushing the loaf, releasing with my left hand. Now the important bit is, some people think that it's some sort of scooping motion. What my bread knife or what my dough knife really is doing is this movement, nothing else. It'll always be in contact with the table. And whenever I take it away, I do that actually quite fast. And if you can see, I'm pushing the dough, giving it even more tension, and then releasing it. If I run out of table, I can just always lift it up with the dough knife and kind of set it in the middle. I'm just pushing it around, creating a nice little round shape. It's nice and tall. And that's really all I'm doing at this point, because this is what's called a pre-shape. And a pre-shape is basically the 1/2 step before the so-called final shape. And all I'm doing here is kind of giving the dough a lot of tension and a lot of structure here so that it's ready for its final shape. And if you can see those little bubbles here on top, that means this is all gluten forming here. But those are actually bubbles this is not fermentation, this is all just the tension through the pushing of the dough. So this now is ready to relax another 20 to 30 minutes to be ready for the final shape. And all I'm doing is basically inverting the bowl on top of it so it doesn't dry out. And I'm going to wait for 30 minutes to relax the gluten a little bit, and then I'm going to give it its final shape. Okay, half an hour later, let's talk about the final shape. As you can see, the dough has relaxed a little bit, but not really much. It's kind of really good at keeping its shape at this point. Now, what we want to do is give it its final shape so that it's ready for the cold proof. And the cold proof means it'll just go into the fridge. And the way it'll go into the fridge is in this so-called banneton. It's a little basket, my little bread basket, and it's a fermentation basket. This is not for baking at all, and everybody makes that mistake once trying to put these guys into the oven. They are not heat proof, they are made out of rattan. It's a natural material that kind of allows the dough to breathe and to, just kind of like exchange moisture to the optimal level. At the same time, this banneton gives the bread its kind of distinctive shape, and as you can see, it has this oblong shape. The French call it the bâtard shape, and it really gives the bread structure to kind of climb up these things to build that nice football shape that we're after. So what we're going to need is this banneton, a little bit of flour. I have here a mixture that's the same mixture that I use to feed my sourdough. It's half rye flour, half wheat flour. I think it has a really nice flavor to it, and also really helps with unsticking it from this lining here. So I'm just gonna grab a little bit of flour at this point. So while I said in the beginning that we don't want to add any flour throughout the process, at this point I'm not too worried about it. The reason for that is that every bit of flour that I'm adding at this point just goes on the surface, and I can easily brush that off later. So this one's flour. What else am I gonna flour? I'm gonna flour the loaf a little bit, from high above, so it doesn't get patchy. What I'm also gonna do is I'm gonna flour my work surface a little bit. Grab a small pinch of flour, and people really try and flouring surfaces from down here. That doesn't really work. What you need to do is actually fling it a little bit, like so. And that'll give a nice even distribution, because you don't want to have big pieces of flour sitting on your board. I'm going to use my dough knife. I'm going to kind of loosen my loaf a little bit, and then I'm actually going to invert it into the floured work surface. So now the smooth side sits on the bottom, okay? And now my goal is to give it a nice shape. What I'm doing to achieve that is I'm gonna grab it from underneath. At this point, I'm really careful not to push any of the gas out. I'm really touching the loaf as little as possible, grabbing it from underneath, just pulling it into sort of a rectangular shape of sorts, okay? That's enough. And then I'm gonna fold it into a burrito shape. Okay, there are a million ways of shaping a loaf. This is just one of them. Okay, I'm gonna fold it over, almost over to the other side. Okay, and now this side goes over the other side as well, holding it in place with my finger. Okay, kind of making sure that it's somewhat even. And this is my nice little burrito, pinching out the gas bubbles that I see. Now, as the last step, what I'm doing is flouring my hands a little bit. I'm rolling this towards me to give it a nice bit of tension. Okay? Start on this side. And as I'm rolling, I'm using my thumbs here to tuck the dough to create a lot of tension. And as you can see, the dough is somewhat stuck here to the table, and I'm using that to my advantage because I'm pulling on the loaf a little bit. And every time I do, the outer surface gets a little more tense. And just keep rolling and tucking, rolling and tucking, rolling and tucking until the seam sits in the bottom. Isn't that lovely? And now all I'm doing is I have this little twirl here, and I'm just going to close that up so that the bread end looks nice and tidy. Okay, I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. And all that's left to do is just kind of let it sit for 30 seconds on its seam to just kind of close naturally. If I want to give it a little more tension at this point, what I can do is I can use my knife. Just kind of push it ever so slightly in this direction, maybe another push in this direction, making sure that the top really stays at the top. And that's a nicely shaped little attar. It has a lot of tension to it. I'm gonna flour it just for good measure, high above. Okay. Now it's ready to go into the banneton. That's nicely floured. If you don't have a banneton, by the way, you can totally take a dish towel, find a nice tight bowl that this just barely fits so that it will keep the shape, and then you invert the loaf into your bowl or your little banneton. Using my bread knife, just kind of flip it over, grabbing it from underneath, putting it into the banneton. And that's a shaping for you. Now this will go into the fridge for basically the rest of the night. Until tomorrow morning, I'm ready to bake this bread. Now, before we actually get into the baking process, I would like to introduce my Dutch oven. And this is basically my most important tool that I use in my home baking setup. I have a regular oven that does not go any higher than 250 degrees Celsius. And this little guy here helps me with trapping the moisture in the bread to make sure that it's nice and steamy. Steam is what helps the bread rise in the oven. It basically prevents the crust from forming in the baking process too early, which would kind of trap the bread in its shape and inhibit it from growing. So when we have a lidded, heavy pot like this, it really helps seal in all that steam and make sure that we have a nicely risen bread out of the oven. Also, it's really heavy, so it retains the heat really well. And this is just really an old steel pot. Many people, when they get into baking, they start buying these super expensive Le Creuset Dutch ovens. You can totally do that if you're gonna splurge a little bit. I think I bought this one for 20 euros off of eBay. Gave it a little TLC for it to be in shape again, and these things last literally forever. So strong recommendation, buy a used pot. They don't cost a lot of money and they last literally forever. So this Dutch oven is going to be in the oven as I preheat for 1 hour at 250 degrees. That's as high as my oven will go, to make sure that this is nice and ripping hot. So this goes into the oven so that I can bake my bread in it. So I'm putting the Dutch oven on the lowest rack. So I don't have any special kind of oven, it's a normal IKEA oven. All I'm doing is I'm putting my Dutch oven on the lowest rack, and I set the temperature to as high as it'll go. In my case, that's 250 degrees Celsius. That's here. And then lastly, the cooking mode that it's on is all available heat sources, which is heat from top and bottom as well as the fan. Okay, we're now in the final step of the process, baking. I put all the tools in front of me so that I have them handy when I need them, because this is such a time-critical process. Let me walk you through what those are. I got the loaf out of the fridge. It spent the night in the coldest part so it doesn't expand. Piece of parchment paper to carry the loaf. Really heat-proof oven mitts. A pastry brush so I can get rid of the excess flour. A razor blade so I can score the loaf. A board to carry it. And finally, a water spritzer to create some steam. The oven is nice and preheated. Take it out of the Dutch oven, close the oven really fast. I'm inverting the loaf on the parchment onto the board. Take my pastry brush, get rid of the excess flour. And now with the razor blade, I hold it at a very shallow angle like so. And I give it a clean cut from the top to the bottom. Lift the loaf into the Dutch oven. Now I'm going to give it a few spritzers. Put the lid on. A few more. Now it goes back into the oven. And I'm immediately lowering the temperature to 230, and I set the time to 20 minutes with the lid on, and in 20 minutes I'm going to take the lid off, and that's it. So here we are coming out of the oven, our lovely bread, smelling nice and fresh. It's cooling on a cooling rack just so it gets some airflow underneath. If you don't have a cooling rack, just put it onto a bias or something so that some air gets underneath so it doesn't get soggy. It is recommended to let it cool off for at least an hour so that all that trapped moisture doesn't go outside. In this case, this is a walnut and rye flake bread. The same basic dough that I keep using and keep improving, but I keep adding ingredients just to make it a little more interesting. What am I looking for in a nice bread? I'm looking for a nice and tall shape so that it doesn't look like a pancake. And I'm looking for a really crunchy crust that just is fun to bite into. And also, this is where I recommend getting a really good bread knife so you don't get stuck with your old bread knife in a solid crust. And I'm looking for a really nice, soft and moist, pillowy crumb. So this is just something that is really versatile. You can put sweet stuff on it, or cheese, or just salted butter, which is my favorite. And this bread keeps amazingly well. It is actually good for at least 3 days. I mean, it usually doesn't last as long in my place, but if it should, it'll be good for 3 days. After that, you can still toast it and enjoy it. So that's our basic recipe. I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'm looking forward to getting questions and comments below. And yeah, happy baking.